Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. And we're just going to give it a minute or two for others to join. And then we'll make a start. Can you hear me okay, Adrian? Just a quick sound check.
Absolutely, I can hear you perfectly.
Perfect. Great. Cool. As we have a packed agenda, let's make a start, if that's okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on deconstructing multiple sources of racial bias in recruitment. And my name is Renu Gundala. I'm founder and director of Talent Grader. For those of you who haven't heard about Talent Grader, it's a dedicated platform for HR and recruitment professionals to find talent assessments easily online and purchase them as well. So this webinar is part of our monthly webinar series, and our guest expert today is Adrian Husbands, who is a psychometrician and diversity and inclusion expert. He has also been a strategic advisor to Talent Grader. So in a moment, I will take an opportunity to introduce him to you guys properly. But before I hand the session over to Adrian, a couple of housekeeping points. This session is being recorded, so we will share the slides with you and the recording as well. So don't worry about making notes. Adrian has a really well-prepared slides with lots of information. So we hope that you'll find those useful, and we'll share those with you. So please, can I ask you to use the Q&A function as opposed to chat function to ask any questions, and we will answer those questions toward the end of the session. So let me introduce you to introduce Adrian to you all. So Adrian Husbands, he's a chartered psychologist and psychometrician, and he has over 14 years of experience in designing and delivering bespoke assessments, both in the UK and internationally. And he's currently serving as a assessment board member at LCO. You may have heard of this global publishing company. And in the past, he's also worked as a deputy director for recruitment in UK shared services. So Adrian is well placed, and he has wealth of experience in both recruitment and psychometrics, in also implementing innovative solutions regarding HR and in the D&I space as well. So without further ado, over to you, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Renu, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. So we are deconstructing multiple sources of bias that may present themselves in recruitment. The first thing I wanted to do was just set the tone, really, for the talk. And it's just really, to say that the matter of racial bias, the matter of racial discrimination in workplaces is very much a very big topic these days for very important reasons. We have many reports that racism is widespread in both public and private sector jobs. And even a recent headline on the BBC referred to shortlisting ethnic minority posts in the church. So I think that it's fair to say that this is a very big issue amongst HR professionals and recruitment professionals around the world. What we will cover really is a look at micro and macro sources of potential bias and then solutions. There are many sources of bias, and in terms of this half-an-hour webinar, we are really aiming to present a summary of these sources. But of course, this is a topic that we can really speak on for quite a long time, and should there be further interest in some of the details that we present, we would be happy to provide a further webinar. In terms of the actual title of the talk, the first thing I did was to deconstruct that, and my deconstruction revealed a deconstructed title, which is identifying several elements related to employer recruitment that can lead to unfair decision-making based on racial/ethnic groups. Okay, the example that we're going to use as a basis really is if we have a large-scale recruitment procedure, so a large company aims to recruit 100 new roles from a pool of 10,000 applicants, and there are 3 constructs that they've said that they want to recruit for, namely communication, problem solving, and creativity. They have asked the recruitment partners to demonstrate how they will address multiple sources of bias at each stage of the recruitment process. And they've even built in SLAs and KPIs regarding diversity and inclusion into the contracts for this resourcing partner. So let's move on swiftly to the first set of problems that can be identified. So I've actually broken these problems down into 3 different stages, namely the pre-interview stage, then the interview stage, and then the post-interview stage. So starting with the pre-interview stage, we have sources of attraction, eligibility sift, CV/application form, and psychometric tests. So when we're talking about attraction and the problems that might manifest within attraction campaigns, one of the first things we need to ask is, do we know where to find the people that we wish to attract? For example, the Met Police and similar organizations would go out into the community to specifically recruit Black and ethnic minority candidates. Healthcare institutions also do the same in terms of going into schools in poorer areas to recruit for new medical students, new dental students, nurses, etc. It's just to say that social media strategies, depending on what the job is, may be sufficient. Sometimes they may not be sufficient if we are really trying to target particular communities. Moving on to the eligibility sift. I remember an example where an applicant was turned down from a role because they did not have British citizenship or permanent residency. What they had was a spouse visa, and according to the recruiter, what happens if they and their partner divorce? All right, so he was not selected for that job because of his residency status, even though he had a right to work in the UK. It's just to say that some of your more diverse candidates may have a right to work in the UK, but they may not appear in the ways that recruiters think that it's going to appear. And that's something that we need to watch out for. Why do we have certain criteria in our eligibility sift? And is it really written accurately, not to exclude particular groups of people? Next up, we've got CV/application form. And I think it's common knowledge that things like name, high school and university reveal information that can lead to biased decision-making. One common strategy is to anonymize CVs, but there are some questions about that. Perhaps this one needs a bit of thought. Anonymizing, for example, could promote colorblind racism, which is this notion of not seeing race or being colorblind to race, because what might happen, unfortunately, is that we might end up negating the cultural values and lived experiences of individuals from diverse backgrounds. So my question is, by anonymizing CVs, are we as HR professionals negating the cultural values and diversity of our candidates? Is this an attempt to avoid the discomfort that's necessary to push our thinking? You know, do we really want to stay in the mental space where we say we have bias, the bias isn't going to go away, so therefore we are going to anonymize CVs and essentially make people a bit nameless? I'm not advocating one or the other, I'm just saying that we really needed to weigh the cost and the benefits to our interventions, and also think about the long and the short term. Maybe the long term, we might want to anonymize CVs in the short term, but then in the long term, we may wish to get to a point where, as resourcing professionals, we have tackled some of these subconscious issues that are present, and we no longer have to do this. Next up, I've got psychometric tests, and I think, again, this is one that is quite a broad one. The adverse impact problem never seems to go away, especially with cognitive ability tests and verbal and numerical reasoning. But the question I have here is, why do we accept this kind of bias in psychometric tests as inevitable? So when we think, for example, about ability tests, or tests of intelligence, tests of verbal and numerical reasoning, how many of us are aware that Carl Pearson and Francis Galton, who were really the originators, modern originators of these kinds of tests, they created the test to unfairly discriminate. They quite overtly said that they wanted to kill people like Blacks and Jews that they saw as undesirable, but they said that this was not socially acceptable anymore in their climate. So what they wished to do was to identify tests of so-called intelligence and sterilize the ones who didn't quite make the grade. And of course, this is no longer mainstream thought at all within the HR community or the scientific community, but it's just to say that we are using the same tools in terms of psychometrics, especially with numerical reasoning tests. And somehow we've gone to a point where we accept that these tests are simply biased against ethnic minorities, and that we need to find ways to compensate against them within our recruitment systems. What I'm saying is that maybe we need to start to question the origins of these tests, because is it really surprising that tests that were designed to discriminate unfairly are discriminating unfairly? Okay, our second half of problems in terms of the micro sources, we've got our pre-recorded interview. I'll just highlight a few issues from this section. Do we really know why we need to see someone's face in a pre-recorded interview or to hear their voice? Why not, for example, have a timed assessment where candidates are asked to answer job-specific questions? Or maybe there's a good reason for a pre-recorded interview. I guess the point here that I'm making is that if there is a relationship between the visual cues that we are observing that might cause the bias and the actual performance on the job, well, then we can consider using it. But why do we necessarily need to see someone's face in a pre-recorded interview when really they are essentially providing answers to questions on a timed basis? In terms of Shirley standards, is something that I really quickly want to point out. In terms of optics, optics is not quite unbiased at all. In terms of the history about videos and optics, unfortunately, most of our cameras are actually carrying inherent bias on their own, and that's because way back in the day, Kodak and other imaging processing companies actually set the color tones within their optical sensors towards a white lady called Shirley, and things haven't really moved on. And that's why sometimes you see people with darker skin tones not really showing up very well in photos. And I have that experience a lot. So it's just to say, again, we need to think about how the optics is actually creating potential bias when it comes to recruitment. When it comes as well to our live interview, we normally expect candidates to be dressed in a certain way. And sometimes we just really need to ask, well, is a suit and tie really necessary for this particular job? If this particular visual cue might be causing us to value a candidate in a different way, is it really relevant to the job? If it's not, why are we requiring candidates to wear a suit and tie for a job where it's not required? Also, we just need to acknowledge that interviews are really, in a scientific way, one of the least effective predictors of job performance in terms of standard structured interviews. The science has moved on actually into things like multiple mini interviews, and HR is lagging behind. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in the solutions section. I just have vetting and references as a final 2 points here. The intention really is to ensure with things like the police NPPV vetting, the government has SC and DV clearance, and the prison service as well has a similar system of vetting. The intention is to ensure that employees have integrity and they're not at-risk employees. However, we've got questions such as name all medications you're currently taking, questions about criminal records, fines, names of parents, properties owned in the UK, overseas, speeding fines, etc. How many applicants are really put off by a lot of these questions? Are these questions really necessary? What we found actually in the industry to do with vetting is that a high proportion of ethnic minority candidates who are offered a job are then rejected from the job at the vetting stage. And we really need to ask whether or not we can develop better proxies of integrity that are not necessarily going to disadvantage candidates. Another aspect of vetting is often financial vetting. I have an example of one Black candidate who applied to a very large bank for an HR job, was turned down because his credit score was too low. After they offered him the job and contacted his employers for references, they said he missed payments. But the question that we have here is that with disproportionately more ethnic minority candidates being unemployed, is this practice of credit scoring applicants showing bias against ethnic minority candidates, many of whom are already in a difficult financial position due to systemic racism? Lastly, on this point, I've mentioned references, in terms of references, there's a lot of research and literature showing that references really aren't giving us much, especially when we think about the bias that it could lead to against ethnic minority candidates who are more likely to be overrepresented in employment tribunals, especially if they face racism in the workplace. So are we excluding candidates based on previous job performance, even though racism is a mediating factor in previous job performance? In terms of the potential solutions, I'll just call out a few of them before moving on to the macro areas. So we've got things like purpose-driven attraction campaigns. So we really think about how we're attracting our staff, increasing perspective taking when we have eligibility sifts. So actually going into the communities that you're trying to attract and explaining the application process and asking them really to critically deconstruct the different stages for various issues such as English language issues or perhaps residency issues that you may not be thinking about when designing the assessment system. Anonymization could be advantageous, but we also have discussed why that might not be the optimal long-term solution. So building awareness of this is quite important. With psychometric testing, I believe that we really need to build a historical awareness of where these biases has come from in terms of the originators of psychometric testing. With interview and post-interview solutions, I think that we again need to build awareness of things like Shirley standards and look out for video interview systems that are compensating to ensure that candidates with darker skin tones are actually represented appropriately. With interviews, I mentioned multiple mini interviews, which is a system of breaking down an interview into different, say, 5-minute snapshots with various members of staff. And that way, by having a collection of diverse individuals rating interview performance separately, the science has shown that that reduces bias and leads to increases in reliability and validity. After the interview, when it comes to vetting and references, one of the very big points is to increase perspective taking. Again, going to these communities and ask people about their opinions about how vetting is actually carried out. Also doing more research to see whether or not this criteria that we use as a proxy for integrity is actually appropriate. So for example, if we're looking for integrity, why not give people integrity tests as part of the vetting solutions? And that's not what's currently done. And that's something that can be certainly developed. Okay, in terms
of a quick heads up on the time. Sorry to interrupt there. We've got about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you. Okay, so that was the micro solutions and problems. Now, to do with the macro, again, I will just highlight some of the points that are here, and of course, slides will be available afterward. We have construct criterion mismatch. The question is really, we're trying to measure things like communication, problem solving, and innovation. And, you know, have you really understood what these things mean? For example, one client encountered a really big problem and they realized that communication was actually a proxy for British politeness, and that candidates were being deselected simply because they weren't polite in a very British way, when that wasn't necessarily relevant to the actual job. So we need to think as well about job performance and how is that actually defined? Is it maintaining the status quo? Are the constructs that we are choosing to measure actually related to success? Think Enron, for example, before they went bankrupt, they probably needed more employees who were willing to challenge senior management. But was that really happening, and did that translate into their recruitment hires? So that's one of the big issues really is construct and criterion mismatch. Defining psychometrics is an issue really that is very close to my heart. So I'll tell you a story. I once attended a meeting involving a national recruitment process, one of the largest in the UK actually. And after I asked the question to do with bias in recruitment, I was told that their assessment center was not a psychometric test and therefore does not need to meet requirements for psychometric test quality, such as reliability. Unfortunately, this perspective is common. Many people view psychometric tests as personality tests and ability tests. However, a psychometric test is any test that's attempting to measure a psychological construct. Same to do with A-levels, GCSEs, maths tests, structured interviews, CV review sessions, depression scales, autistic skills. All of these are psychometric tests. And when we really start to realize that, we can then start to see the whole assessment process as a system. Your end-to-end assessment process is a psychometric test. Whenever you're assessing candidate for a construct, this is a psychometric test. So that would really lend for a more holistic view. Distancing / cancel culture is just really to say that, one racist slur seems to end someone's very distinguished career, and companies promote zero tolerance policies. They have very punitive measures for people who do or say racist things immediately. It's not to say people don't need to be held accountable, but it's just to say, why is it that when racism may appear, we might seek to distance ourselves from it and not necessarily tackle something that has been unconscious and is now conscious. Now this is time that we can tackle it. Why do we try to distance ourselves from this and simply persecute people without actually trying to figure out how we can help this individual, how we can learn as an organization from particular incidents. Neglecting moral reasoning, and the role of that is just to say that obedience to laws and authority and conformity is usually viewed as the highest form of moral reasoning, but obedience to laws is actually not the highest form of moral reasoning. Unfortunately, the focus within HR has often been to really focus on not breaking any laws, but we're saying that we really need a more principled approach. Political bias is the last one for macro sources, and it's just to say that anti-racism and diversity and inclusion are not occurring within a neutral space. Our politicians haven't been selected according to HR best practice on diversity and inclusion. We see this all around us. Those who have the power to set the agenda and the funding, etc., to look at bias are mainly, in this country, white people, also with a vested interest, either consciously or subconsciously, in the status quo. Should we then be surprised that we have persistent problems with bias in recruitment? One comment that was given to me by a very senior board member of a company said that deep down, he didn't believe that his colleagues really want competition for their children, because reducing bias in recruitment does just that. Are we prepared to robustly challenge senior leaders on their own bias? Okay. Now, in terms of solutions, again, I'll just mention some of these quite quickly. Construct definition, I've mentioned we really need to think about what we're measuring, be very thoughtful about it and how we're measuring it, and whether or not the things that we're measuring are actually contributing to bias. Educating stakeholders on the true scope, that's really related to the end-to-end recruitment process. Again, your end-to-end recruitment process is one psychometric test. And so that has to be checked for bias, as opposed to simply some of the for example, looking at the personality test or the cognitive ability test for bias. And we're really looking at a holistic end-to-end approach. Psychological safety for white people. There are many comments that I've had personally. Even one of my colleagues has said, you know what, I need to move out of diversity inclusion space because I don't feel, I feel it's too much of a minefield. We need to create a safe space for conflict resolution and learning, and dismantle punitive zero tolerance policies around racism. If we are all learning, and our white colleagues need to have the psychological safety to be able to make mistakes. Still, yes, we need to hold people accountable and learn from these mistakes, but then they need to feel comfortable in this space. We should not be vilifying people because they made mistakes. We all make mistakes, and we should not be judgmental in that regard. So I encourage compassion and non-judgment. The final two are really about looking at post-conventional moral reasoning, and that's really to say that this kind of moral reasoning, the highest level of moral reasoning is actually being principled, even if that means going against the herd, even if that means going against the laws. It's really going beyond the legalistic approach and saying, okay, what is really for the benefit of the people? And I can use an example, the Jim Crow laws, in the civil rights era in America, that allow for discrimination. Only those in the post-conventional bracket who actually understood that in terms of moral reasoning, we need to go beyond the laws would have actually still had inclusive hiring processes. And finally, building awareness of political bias in terms of our stakeholders, who is actually funding, who are funding a lot of our recruitment campaigns. Do they have blind spots? And are we willing to call these blind spots out? We need to critically appraise the end-to-end recruitment plans within the context of the wider socio-political landscape. The next two slides are just really summaries that you're able to take away when the slides are distributed, with the micro and the macro sources in full. The last few comments that I'll really make is that systemic problems require systemic solutions. The end-to-end process is a psychometric test, and we need to avoid the bias both in the component and also at a systemic level. We need to avoid solutions that allow us to emotionally bypass our discomforts about race, and allow others to make mistakes while maintaining accountability. So dismantle your zero tolerance policies that attempt to get rid of people the second that they show signs of racism. We can use that as an example for learning and for bringing things to the conscious that have previously been suppressed. And overall, we need to keep being willing to challenge the status quo and ask difficult questions, and really realize that every opportunity that we have where a mistake or a misstep was made is an opportunity for growth. Okay, and that's the end of the webinar session from me. Over to you, Rena.
Perfect. Thank you, Adrian. we have a couple of questions, but we've run out of time. So shall we just cover that question if, for those of you who would like to stay behind and listen in, but we will also follow up in writing that response for those of you who have to go now. So one of the questions is, with HR often being slow to adapt and business reluctant to change their ways, it's likely to take time for solutions to be implemented. So what advice can we give to candidates at risk of discrimination to increase their chances of getting jobs?
I would say increase the assertiveness amongst candidates. There can be a sense of helplessness when we're applying for jobs. So in the example of my colleague, for who was declined from, he was offered the job and then he was rejected from it because of his credit score. My encouragement is, I said, well, even though you might be quite junior, to the actual, in terms of the actual role, is to challenge that, is to write to their HR director and to say, well, no, actually, I'm sorry, I don't accept this. I think that your reason, respectfully, is not appropriate for the following reasons, and to actually keep going up the chain. If you do not get a response from the HR personnel involved, politely speak to their line manager, politely speak to the CEO if necessary. It's just to say that the applicants as well, I believe, have a role to play in challenging the status quo and really calling out unfair and biased practices.
Thank you, Adrian. That's a great response. I fully support that as well. And thanks for taking time. That was very insightful. Lots of great real-life examples for us to take away. So I have a couple more questions, but I won't be able to cover those as we've run out of time, but we will follow up with questions. But thank you so much, Adrian, for taking time to put this together at a short space of time. And thanks, everyone, for being here. Much appreciated. We'll follow up with recording and slides. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Renu. Bye.